My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, it's a city break in the land of the dead, I assume. It's the Necropolis.
Hello, Tom.
Hello, Jason. I'm not in this one, am I?
You are not in this one. No, in this one, I have brought on a guest who we're going to go listen to our conversation in a bit. But let me tell you about the guest. For the Necropolis, I'm talking to Scott Dorward. Scott is a writer and podcaster specializing in horror RPGs. He has worked on a number of game lines, most notably Call of Cthulhu and World War Cthulhu, co-authoring books such as The Two-Headed Serpent, Nameless Horrors, and the revised edition of Masks of Nyarlathotep. As a podcaster, he is a regular cast member on Ain't Slayed Nobody, How We Roll, and Grizzly Peaks Radio, and is co-host of The Good Friends of Jackson Elias alongside Matt Sanderson, and a regular cast of guest hosts where they discuss the Cthulhu mythos, horror films, weird fiction, and horror gaming in general. The Good Friends is a terrific podcast. If you're not listening to that, you definitely should.
It certainly is. You've done well to get Scott on. He's like horror RPG podcasting, if not royalty, at least, let's say, landed gentry. I don't know, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I think he would like that characterization, ironically. Let's go listen to our conversation. Okay, it's Fear of a Black Dragon, and I am here today with Scott Dorward. Hi, Scott.
Hello, Jason. Thank you very much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this.
We're talking about the Necropolis, and so let's dive right in with the basic crawl.
The Necropolis is an introductory scenario for Call of Cthulhu written by Lee Carr, featuring art by Chris Huth and cartography by Matt Ryan. We're looking at the version that was included in Gateways to Terror, which was published in 2019 for 7th edition Call of Cthulhu. From the introductory text, November 26, 1924. You have been working tirelessly with shovel, spade and trowel in the Egyptian Valley of the Kings. The sun beats down upon you as you carefully unveil the facade of an ancient structure cut deep into a cliff face, buried by the sands of several millennia. Your party of contracted labourers works like busy ants, and soon a doorway is uncovered. You stand proudly at the top of 13 steps that descend to an entryway covered by a large stone slab.
The book starts with a short introduction, after which the scenario has a section about the investigators who will be going into this ancient crypt, including descriptions of a number of pre-generated characters, their traits, and some role-playing hooks. This section also has some notes for how to adapt the scenario depending on the number of players available. The scenario begins with Imprisoned in the Valley of the Kings, in which we see the characters trying to get into the Necropolis. Next comes Discoveries in Darkness, wherein our characters begin traversing the dark corridors of the tomb, are sealed in, and are then presented with the 5 main areas of the module: the passageway, the antechamber, the annex, the burial chamber, and the treasury. The characters can investigate these various areas, acquiring treasures and looking at murals that depict a number of horrific scenes, including one which heralds the approach of the Black Pharaoh, Nyarlathotep. Eventually, an abomination hidden in the Necropolis awakens, and the party is now under pressure to finish their exploration and escape or face the horror that is now approaching them. We then have a conclusion section detailing a number of different ways the scenario might end. The module itself ends with monster stats, pre-generated character sheets, and various handouts. So let's talk about our respective bona fides with the Necropolis. Scott, what about you?
Yeah, I've run this a few times. Most notably, I ran it, God help me, as a live performance at a podcast convention in Birmingham in 2019 with How We Roll. And the reason I picked this was because we had a very limited time slot, and I was looking around for something that I could fit within the hour and a quarter we had. And this seemed like the best fit. And then once I got into it, I realized it was also a really good scenario.
Fantastic. I've only read it, but I have to say, I feel like I've played it. Like, it has such a familiarity to it. Pop culture wise, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about things we like about the Necropolis. I'll say just at the outset, In terms of organization and presentation, the module is really easy to follow. It has really nice art. I particularly like the old photos. The handouts are fun. The map handouts are particularly great because you get a version of the handouts that does not have the secret door on it. I find it deeply annoying when you get a map in a book and it has the S's where the secret doors are, because it makes it unusable at the table. So I really appreciated that. From a sort of like just high level, like at a glance, based off the look of it, is really great. It feels really easy to run. Is that your sense of it?
Absolutely, yeah. I ran an earlier version of this, so there's a bit of history. It started out as a demo scenario for Call of Cthulhu that was free on the Chaosium website, but they compiled the 3 short demo scenarios that they had into this book, Gateways to Terror, which then expands them slightly and gave them better artwork and stuff like that. But the fact that it is designed as a demo scenario, it's got all these additional tools for new keepers that sort of explain how things work and give them perhaps more options so they don't have to think of stuff on the fly. And also just the fact that it is a very sort of geographical scenario. By that I mean that it's described in terms of locations, that the locations are very limited, they're quite small ones. There isn't a lot for the keeper to absorb. It's the kind of scenario where you can read through it once and you'll be able to run it, which isn't the case with a lot of Call of Cthulhu scenarios.
Yeah, that was my takeaway from just a read. I haven't run Call of Cthulhu in many years, and so I'm not super well versed in the ins and outs of Call of Cthulhu, especially 7th edition. But reading through this scenario, I felt really confident that I could run this with no trouble. In addition to the things you noted about how it's a pretty contained space, 5 areas, and it's all laid out nicely and easy to navigate, I also think the module does a particularly good job with keeper support. I am a keeper support GM support game writer. I'm really into communicating with the keeper and trying to give the keeper little tidbits. And the keeper support in this is really terrific. I like that it talks about how to adjust the scenario based off the number of players. It even has, here's a place to put some foreshadowing, like the pebbles falling from the ceiling of the chamber to foreshadow the cave-in. It's got lots of little touches and even like role-playing notes for the keeper. And I really, really like that. Especially like for a scenario that's meant to be a starter scenario, there's a really strong chance it's your first scenario as a keeper too, right? It's likely to be, if you were, to the extent that you are a first-time keeper, this might be one of the scenarios you run for your first time. And so, yeah, I really liked it in that way. I kind of want to dive into some of the story aspects or the setting aspects of it. What do we think about this sort of pulpy Egyptology or crawling around in old Egyptian tombs thing?
Yeah, I think it's such an accessible idea. If you gave this as a pitch to a group of new Call of Cthulhu players who'd never heard of Lovecraft, never heard of Call of Cthulhu, perhaps even hadn't played an RPG before, you could still explain the setup. You could give them the characters. The characters are very broad archetypes. You tell them that it's the Valley of the Kings in 1924, shortly after the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, and they'll have some idea in mind about all that. Even if they don't know the history of it, they've undoubtedly seen horror films with mummies and Egyptology in there.
Yeah.
So all of this is going to be so familiar to them, even before they get started, that you don't really have to front load it at all. It's, here are your character sheets, here's the situation, go.
I found the pulpy adventure tropes very appealing. This is a bit of a digression, and certainly folks who have heard me talk about games before know my feelings about this, but I am a big believer in this idea that in role-playing games, in the specific context of tabletop role-playing games, tropes are beneficial, right? Yeah. They have a great benefit to them. For reasons like you just said, it's easy to get into it. In role-playing games, we have this issue that you don't have in other forms of entertainment, where we all have to get together and imagine something together, and we have our own distinct headspaces of what things might be like or are like. And a trope is such a nice shortcut to getting straight into the story and really truly like creating space for your characters to do something more interesting with it. Having the baseline of like classic setup does a lot of work at the table. And so I really appreciated the Necropolis for that.
Yeah.
I think structurally, this is a very strong scenario. It's so good. I think it's easy to miss. And here's what I mean by that. You can speak more to this because you've run it, but it feels very well made for beginners, which I've noted before. I felt very comfortable reading it and felt comfortable that I could do it. But maybe more importantly, for our purposes here, the narrative beats are pitch perfect in this. It has such a classic pulpy feel, which we've talked about, interspersed with the horror bits. But I love just the structure of it. The arrival, how do we get in? Oh, we're trapped. Well, we're trapped. We might as well search around and see what we can find. Oh, now there's something waking up. Oh shit, there's a monster. Just such perfect narrative beats. And what's great about that, especially as a sort of starter or one-off scenario, is you're getting like a nice, satisfying story loop there. You're getting every part of the pig in terms of a good story in this tight time frame. Is that your experience running it and playing it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's really easy to handle those timings as well. This is something that I've really come to appreciate with time-limited scenarios, which is that one bit of advice in there, which, again, it's really easy to take for granted, but that little bit that at about 30 to 40 minutes, the abomination should wake up. And that is the key to everything there with the timing of it. If you're going to run this in an hour or an hour and a quarter, as I had, then that means that you have a defined end game that kicks in at that stage and you know roughly how long it's going to run. But the thing that I really like about that ending is that it's not wholly prescribed. And this is something that I think Call of Cthulhu scenarios in general have got a lot better at since the 1980s, and this is a great example of it, which is there was a tendency, I think, in a lot of scenario writers' minds to say, right, and this is the ending. This is what the player characters have to do to resolve this. You know, here's the ritual they have to perform, or here's the magic item that they have to get, which is the only way of killing this monster.
Right.
And yeah, that's fine, but it's a bit boring, really, because
and it's the classic criticism of Call of Cthulhu, right?
Yeah, you're being told what to do, so you ultimately all you're doing is rolling dice to see whether it succeeds or fails. But here, it's built into it that there are all sorts of different ways that it could go, and Likar covers all of them in the ending section, giving detailed advice to the keeper about how to handle them. And I think the unwritten bit, which is something that I normally put in my scenarios, is that the keeper should always be open to solutions that the player characters come up with which aren't covered by these. Think of appropriate dice to roll for whatever crazy plan they come up with, but don't just block it because it's not there in the scenario.
Well, and that goes back to what I said earlier about keeper support, because I think the reason why you can have that little bit of flexibility here, the way this does, is because the module is cognizant of it and gives the keeper a surprising number of tools, I found, in such a short module to adapt and improvise as needed, even to the point of the conclusion section. Maybe all Call of Cthulhu modules are written that way, I don't know, but I love that the conclusion section has a menu really of like, here's all the different things that might happen, and even if your characters don't do one of those exact things, you have a good range and spectrum of possibilities in your mind of how this could go. I really appreciate it from that standpoint.
Yeah.
You have a note here about environmental storytelling. I love that.
Yeah, because one thing that's unusual about this scenario is that there aren't any NPCs for the players to interact with.
Right.
There is a monster, but there aren't any NPCs for them to talk to. There's some handouts that they might encounter that could give them a bit of backstory, but fundamentally that isn't vital. So almost everything that they're going to learn about the setting and what they've got themselves into is stuff that they're going to pick up, for a start, from reading the hieroglyphs on the wall and inferring stuff from the location. But there are all sorts of just little hints as to what's going on that aren't made explicit. that give the keeper, and more importantly the players, just enough to deduce from all the little clues that are around without having to make any huge leaps what is happening.
Right.
And that's really neat.
I agree completely. And to some degree, our remit here on this show is to just be like, hey, listeners, here's the cool factor. Here's the wow factor of this module. And I think the wow factor of this module is the annex room that has all those murals, like you mentioned. To my mind, it's the best part of the module. I think the Abomination is pretty cool too. But I really love that mural room because, for one thing, the writing is just particularly good there. For whatever reason, like they decided to have that be the really nice descriptive bits of the text, but it's telling you something. It's telling you something about the past. It's hinting at the broader world. And indeed, one of the questions I have for later is connected to that. So I'll put a pin in that for now. This module is very effective in what it gets done in such a small amount of space in terms of, okay, here's a module I'm going to run to sell my group on Call of Cthulhu. This feels like such a good module for that, right? You're getting every part of it in this small space. I think it's great. Yeah.
Exactly.
So great.
Because there are a number of different aspects of Call of Cthulhu that players, people who are used to other game systems or haven't played an RPG before, might not immediately get. And there's all the fairly subtle investigative stuff with translating documents, making sense of the hieroglyphs and so on. But also just in terms of searching around, making connections between the different items you find, that is a great introduction to getting into that mindset. But there are also a couple of things that I think set the tone for Call of Cthulhu in a fantastic way. One is the fact that it's very, very likely to end up as a TPK.
It's deadly, yeah.
Well, it's not guaranteed, though, and that's a really cool thing. You can survive, but you're going to have to be either clever or very lucky in order to do so.
Well, let's go to questions we had. I didn't really have any questions as such. It's a pretty straightforward module. I guess the one thing I do wonder about, mostly because I'm not I haven't played Call of Cthulhu in any serious way in a long time. I'm curious, was this module does it or can it fit into a full campaign of the game? Because it reads like it could be a prologue. Maybe you play these characters first, glimpse the horror, glimpse Nyarlathotep, and then you fast forward to a new group of characters in, back in Arkham or whatever.
Yeah.
Or do you think you could pick up directly from this? The fact that it's also very deadly makes me wonder how it fits into a broader campaign structure. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you could potentially use this as a springboard into a larger game, particularly if the Abomination escapes.
Right, okay.
I think that is a nice little hook there where you could then perhaps play another group of investigators who are there to try to mop up what the first group of investigators unleashed, which I think is such a classic Call of Cthulhu thing, that we started out as the solution, but we ended up as the problem.
I think I kind of like it as a prologue. I think that's where this fits, what I would kind of do with it. What was your question?
It's not really a question. It was more just an observation and wondering how I might have dealt with it better in other circumstances, which is the opening scene of this is designed to plunge the player characters in. And this is one of the reasons why I chose this for running it at the live event, because I've run enough stuff for actual plays that I know what actual play players are like. They will faff around and get into character and digress, and you trying to keep them on track and getting to a conclusion within the time you've got. Yeah, I mean, good luck. And I thought, here we go. We've got this thing where you just basically step over the threshold and then this doorway crashes shut behind you, trapping you inside. It took me 10 fucking minutes to get them over that threshold.
Yeah, I know. Here's the thing. I am a hard frame GM. People who play with me know this. I frame the shit out of things. And especially in a circumstance where there's no other thing we're going to be doing today but those characters going into the tomb, there's literally no other possibility of anything else happening. We start the game with them already walking in the dark corridor, right? They're halfway down the corridor already when they start. And then later we drop the thing. When I hard frame like that, what I'll do to make it a little more satisfying is I will pose a question to the group that explores the motivations of the characters, what they hope to find in this crypt, why did they get into this line of work, like just something like that to get them all thinking about their characters a little bit, thinking about why they're there. And then once that's all done, and then you hear a rumble and the slab falls and then we're in, right? That's how I would handle it. But like there would be no effing around at the front door. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Scott.
The antechamber, when you go in there and see all the items in there, that wonderful what the fuck moment of looking around and there's a rowboat and a golden chariot in there.
I love this little descriptive bit. Taking a closer look at the sealed doorway that leads to the burial chamber reveals that the two large statues on either side of the entrance are actually mummified men impaled on long spears to hold them upright. And if that wasn't gruesome enough, their heads have been replaced, one with that of a crocodile and the other with that of a jackal.
The cave-in, where the abomination blunders around and causes the structure to collapse. And I loved the fact that this is a literal rocks fall, everyone dies moment.
On the southern and northern walls are two large murals, while at the eastern wall is a shrine on which stands an inverted 5-foot-tall golden ankh. Hundreds of golden tendrils reach out from this symbol.
The idea that you can potentially get the abomination to free you by almost playing Matador and getting it to charge at you and smash through the barrier that's stopping you escaping. But the description in there about if you fail the dodge roll, well, you're just like a red smear against the stone block, I thought was beautiful.
Finally, the 4 mostly normal jars contain the ancient dried remains of the abomination's internal organs, lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines. However, if the jar with the inverted ankh is handled, a distinct pulse can be felt from within. Opening the jar reveals the abomination's beating heart. Let's go to the expert delve. Hey listeners, Jason here. I want to let you know about a brand new show. It's called the Gauntlet Podcast 2nd Edition, and it's an exploration and celebration of the indie tabletop RPG scene. The show is called 2nd Edition because it's a reboot of the old Gauntlet podcast, but also because in this new format, my co-host Wes and I are looking back at a classic indie RPG and then talking about what we would do if we were making a 2nd edition of that game. As of this recording, we've already covered Dance of the Damned, The Sword, the Crown, and the Unspeakable Power, and Dogs in the Vineyard, and we have plenty more in the pipeline. Wes and I will also be chatting with folks both in and outside the Gauntlet community about different gaming-related topics, such as fandom in TTRPGs, the effects of the Satanic Panic in the early 80s and 90s, genre in games, and much more. The Gauntlet Podcast 2nd Edition is a Patreon exclusive. We've created this show for the ride or die Gauntlet fans who support everything we do on Patreon. There will be a new episode in the Patreon feed every single week, and you can get exclusive access by making a $2 or higher pledge. We're at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks. It's the Expert Delve, and today we are talking about horror writing in games. Now, listeners, as you know, Tom and I have done many horror topics on this show, but mostly from the vantage point of the GM and like portraying horror at the table. We infamously did an episode where it was just an hour of Tom and I making gross noises with our mouths. But since we've got Scott here, we're going to do a writing horror for games topic. And in particular, I want to emphasize, I think the advice we have to share is going to be applicable to people who write horror games professionally, like Scott and I do, but also for people who are just writing things for their table, because there is a really interconnected skill there. And so, you know, this is so interesting to me because as I was thinking about this topic, Scott, it occurred to me that I do write a lot of horror content for games, but I almost exclusively write content for my games, you know, so, and I think that makes my perspective a little bit different. And you've done a lot of writing for Call of Cthulhu and other things. And so I think our two different perspectives are going to be kind of interesting there in that sense. At a high level, what would you say is your purpose as the horror writer in games? How is it different from being a fiction writer? How do you approach it differently?
There's a friend of mine, Nathan Ballingrud, who's a horror author. He doesn't write RPGs, he writes horror fiction. But we were playing Call of Cthulhu together at some stage. We were playtesting a scenario that I'd written, and I was talking about the process of writing it and developing it. He had an insight which has stayed with me since then, which is that writing horror scenarios is like the opposite or the inverse of writing a horror story, that you're writing the negative space in which the story happens.
Yes.
You're providing the structure, the framework, the location, the characters, some of the imagery, the themes, the motifs, but you're not creating the story. You're not talking about how the characters react to all that, how they're changed by it. You're not coming up with a resolution to it. And yeah, I think that sums up the difference for me as to what a horror scenario and what a horror story is. My personal philosophy about it, and this applies just as much to GMing as it does to writing scenarios, which is that as either a scenario author or as a GM, it's my job to come up with problems but not solutions. It's the player's job to come up with solutions. I'm there to provide those challenges, those things for them to kick against, those conflicts. And that's what the scenario is ultimately, a series of conflicts that need resolution.
Something I think about a lot because of this show, because we tend to look at like older modules and things, or at least things that are inspired from an older time in the hobby. One thing that you find when you look at the really old scenarios, like Dungeons and Dragons modules from the late 70s or early 80s or things like that, one thing you find is that they are written at a level of detail that is so dense and makes it kind of hard to use at the table. In the worst cases, they are quite literally telling you exactly how everything should play out, how everything will play out, and here's the ending of it. What you find as the industry gets better at the hobby, as we learn more the power of the medium and we learn more like what works and what doesn't work, and as new games come out and we iterate on things, we reach this point which you've described. We reach this point where the writer's job is not to say A to Z or A to B to C to D to E to Z, everything that happens in the story. It is, like you said, the negative space. My game writing takes this idea to not quite its extreme, but pretty darn close, in that the scenarios, such as they are for my games, like the mysteries, they have a very simple presentation. Here's the situation. Here's what's going on. And then it's just a toy box of elements at that point. There's not even like a loose narrative arc. It's literally just, here's the situation, here's the question you're trying to answer, and now here's 7 really cool characters, here's 7 really cool locations, here's some fun little things you can sprinkle around here or there, here's a few dangers, use them as you wish. It almost takes the idea of a module or a story and breaks it up into parts and then just sets them out and says use them as you need them. To piggyback off this idea of negative space, I find the best horror writing for games is when the players are actually filling in the gaps, because they're always going to fill it in with something that's creepier than you can manage in your text, right? And so anytime you can create space for that, create space for players to start thinking of the possibilities or the ramifications or the ultimate dark conclusions, that's always more effective. Which is not to say the horror writer in games doesn't have a job here. We truly do, but it's just kind of how we present it and structure it.
Well, I think there are different expectations for scenarios for different systems.
Sure.
So, for example, for the Carved by Brindlewood games, they are, as you mentioned, very bare bones and notional things that are collections of elements that, where the players and the GM fill in the context and structure those according to what's going on in the game, which I think is absolutely perfect. But with something like Call of Cthulhu, because it's been around for almost 45 years at this stage, and I think there are a lot of expectations as to what a Call of Cthulhu scenario is, there's perhaps going to be people picking them up. Generally, not always, it depends on the players, it depends on the GM, but are generally going to want more, I don't want to say story, but I guess more context, more backstory, more structure to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Finding then that balance when you're providing all that context between that and not being completely prescriptive and you're not playing through someone else's story, that I think is a very difficult balancing act. I mean, it's one that throughout all the stuff that I've written for games like Call of Cthulhu that I've tried very hard to maintain, where I want them to feel like Call of Cthulhu scenarios. I want them to have that rich backstory, but I don't want them to end up feeling like passive experiences at the end.
Right. I think there's probably like a middle place. You're right. It kind of depends on what game you're writing for. And if you are, especially if you're writing professionally for like Chaosium or something, if you're publishing something for their game, or if you are writing a horror dungeon crawl for some game, you have to fit whatever the house style and expectations are of the game and whoever you're working with. I do think, though, that there is some space to invite the players into that negative space, right? And to create it, even in those more detailed modules and those more prescriptive is not the right word, but like, here's more stuff and a more like linear progression. I think that paint the scene questions as we use them in my games are a really fantastic thing. They can be put in any game. There's nothing particular about Carl from Brindlewood that makes paint the scene a thing. I mean, as evidenced by the fact that I developed the technique many, many years before I published Brindlewood Bay. You can just write a question that just probes an idea about this place that they're in, or like as you walk into this underground cavern, how can you tell looking around that something evil lives here, right? Just something like that.
Yes.
The players can answer it. Whatever they answer, it doesn't have to be true. It doesn't necessarily mean it's what's definitely happening in that cave, but it at least gets players thinking in terms of the dark cave with the evil thing in it, and they can start imagining things. And I think a generous, clever keeper will incorporate some of those things as best they're able. But even in this like more traditional module structure, you can have questions like that invite players into the horror space.
Yeah.
That's my personal writing style. Here's a big picture idea of what we're doing, and now here are all the little ways I'm inviting you in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I played a Call of Cthulhu game where Cuppy Cup was running it recently. It wasn't for an actual play. It was just something that he ran for a group of friends. And he did explicitly incorporate the paint the scene, the mechanic. After having played now 2 campaigns with you, he decided he wanted to try that. And yes, in this heavily improvised Call of Cthulhu game that he ran, it worked really well for setting up each one of the locations that we went into.
That's fantastic. I think I'd like to zoom in now on actual practical tips and advice for writing. We are both writers. We do a lot of writing. How do you approach it? What do you think is particularly good for people who do have to produce something where there's an expectation of a little bit more polish as opposed to something you might do for your home game?
The first bit of advice I'd offer is that everyone's process is going to be different. Right. So I don't think anything that you can tell people and that I can tell people will necessarily work for them. We can tell other people what works for us, but that may be entirely antithetical to the way their brain works. This is something that I, when I started out writing years ago, I really wish I'd known, because I think there's a tendency when you're a new writer of any kind to look at other people's writing advice and take it as gospel and sort of think, that's what I should be doing. And then, perhaps it takes you 5 years to realize that, no, that doesn't work for you at all. If something's not working for you, that's not a failure of yourself. That just means that it's not the right process for you. But the process I use is a very iterative one. I'll start off generally with a very loose idea. When I'm developing a scenario, I'll have a sort of general concept of what it is, the setting, and the kind of conflicts that are involved in it. But I won't necessarily know all the locations and the NPCs and things that are going to happen in there. So what I'll try to do is come up with a strong opening scene, a scene that sets up the themes and the ideas of the scenario, that sets up the initial conflicts, that presents the setting of it in a way that the players can immediately grasp, and then have some loose idea of the rest. And then what I'll start doing is I'll start playtesting from that point of view before I even really know what I'm doing. I'll start off generally with people I know are going to throw themselves into the scenario and do unpredictable things and generally make me work for it. Then that will help me work out what needs to be in the scenario, because I'll improvise around what they're doing, I'll react to it, I'll flesh out the conflicts and the setting and the characters more and more, and I'll try to run as many playtests as I can fit in.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Ideally for me, I'm looking at least 7 or 8 playtests for a scenario before I sit down to actually start writing it.
Oh, wow. Okay.
By the time I get to that stage, I create a list of bullet points before I start, and I mean, it's usually things like character names and stuff like that, the things that I'm really terrible at improvising, but it's also perhaps... Have you ever played Ron Edwards' Sorcerer?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so you know about bangs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very much how I think, even when I'm developing Call of Cthulhu scenarios, I think in terms of bangs. So bangs are, for anyone who hasn't encountered them before, they are problems or situations, events that the player characters have to react to. They present problems but not solutions. And so it's, here is this thing that's happened, what are you going to do about it? You can't ignore it. Those and the locations of the character names are usually what my bullet points are when I'm starting, and then I'll expand that with each playtest. And by the end of it, I'll have a structure of locations, perhaps scenes, certainly characters, and definitely bangs and possible resolutions. And much like we saw with the Necropolis, I'll put multiple possible resolutions in there with a reminder to the keeper that they should be flexible if the players come up with something else clever. And then, the rest of it is just basically shaping all that, revising it, and just fleshing it all out. And perhaps doing a bit of research to bring the historical aspects of it to life, or, if it's set somewhere that I don't particularly know well, then I'll do reading about that location and try to bring those details in to make it feel a bit more real. And, that's pretty much it.
That's fantastic. Our processes are definitely very different. When I'm writing something for one of my games that is going to be published, meaning it must be sound, right? It has to be sound in whatever way that, whatever that means. We have a little bit more wiggle room in our publications because they are not like traditional structures, right? And they're a little bit more abstract. And so we don't have to have everything play tested as much. I don't think it's like super necessary for our stuff. But having said that, we release things and then let it live for a couple years before we go to Kickstarter. Yeah. And so we get our playtesting in a sense. But one thing I like to do is I will often have like an idea for a creepy set piece, like a really scary set piece, maybe something inspired by a movie I watched or something. I still haven't figured out how to do the shunting in a game, but I'm going to figure it out. So, I'll think of a creepy set piece, a really cool character. I'll just have some kind of mix of little things I want to try out that might end up in a mystery someday, or might end up being the center of a mystery. But what I'll do is I will run something like Cthulhu Dark by Graham Walmsley. Yeah. I'll run Cthulhu Dark, and I'll throw that stuff into Cthulhu Dark, because Cthulhu Dark, you can get to the table in about 5 minutes.
Yes.
And the rules are so light that it's like essentially no prep. And it's such a perfect play testing the vibes system. If that makes sense, because I can get it to the table quickly and just see if that character, that set piece, that gross thing I had in mind, just to see if it lands. Yeah. And that's outside of the context of rules and mechanics. It's just, are the vibes good on this? Is this scary? Is this what people want?
Yeah, I've used Cthulhu Dark in exactly the same way. As a sort of, going back to my old days of working in IT, as a rapid prototyping system.
Yes. Yep.
But it does something else as well. So there's a book that I co-authored a while back for Chaosium called Nameless Horrors, which is... The remit of it, this was something that I pitched to the others and we ended up going with, was that the scenarios in it all had to be, as the name suggests, non-standard or non-canon. Lovecraftian or mythos entities, that we had to come up with something that the players wouldn't have seen before. But also the other aspect, which I don't think we actually specified in the book or in the introduction, was that all of these scenarios had to have at least the option of non-violent solutions, because too many Call of Cthulhu scenarios that I played ended up with a big punch-up at the end, and I was interested in scenarios that were perhaps more nuanced than that. And Cthulhu Dark ended up being the perfect way of testing that word, because violence isn't a resolution in it. Violence isn't an option.
Right.
You fight a monster, you die. That meant that by using Cthulhu Dark, I could test that the stuff that I was working on actually fitted my own remit.
That's fabulous. And I'm guessing that I also get that out of it. But I don't think I ever thought about it in those terms. You're right. The fact that you literally can't do combat in Cthulhu Dark forces you to focus on more environmental or subtle or alternative problem-solving things that your scenario might have. Here in a bit, I want to talk about writing for your home game, because I think that's different. But before we move on to that, and this is a topic that's probably relevant to both professional and home game writing, I'm curious about your approach to research, or what you consume before you begin writing, or how you use other media. To my mind, more than any other type of genre writing in games, horror wants a bit more on the actual creative writing part of it, if that makes sense. Like, it wants a little bit more. It needs a little bit more descriptiveness. It needs things that pop a little bit more. I don't know, maybe it's just my bias, but that's my sense of it. All of that is just to say, I always approach horror writing in a really particular way, which is very subgenre focused. I'm very focused on which subgenre of horror am I working in for this project, or for this scenario, or for this mystery. And I tend to want to consume things in that subgenre, perhaps because I'm going to directly emulate what I'm doing, or I'm going to try to emulate it in game form. That's often what's going on. It's because I'm a PBTA gamer. It's in my blood. But also, I just like to have all that stuff swirling around in my mind. It's just there in a subconscious way, like informing how I create, if I'm immersed in that particular subgenre. I'm curious how you feel about research. I'm curious how you feel about this idea of how that research can inform the actual prose.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I've kind of mashed up two topics there, but yeah.
No, it's good. When I do research for scenarios, it's very rarely on the horror aspect of it. It's more on the real world foundations and the setting. If it's a historical scenario, on the history, or certainly on the geography, the place where it all takes place. I don't necessarily do research or specifically set out to get inspiration for the horrific or the weird aspects of it. I think part of that is just simply because I've been reading horror stories and watching horror films for over 50 years at this stage.
Right, yeah.
And as a result, it's all in there already.
That's like, this is just you, Scott. Like, yeah.
But no, I get what you're talking about there. And I mean, certainly sometimes, I'm trying to think of specific examples, but sometimes, if I've been inspired by a particular story, with Call of Cthulhu, sometimes if it's been inspired by a particular Lovecraft story, I'll go back and I'll reread that just to get the juices flowing again. Sometimes, if I've been partially inspired by a film, I'll go back and watch it again just to make sure that I'm not ripping it off too much.
Too much.
Yeah. So, for example, I mean, there's a scenario I wrote. I won't mention what it is because it's a bit of a spoiler, but there's a scenario that I wrote a while back which borrows quite heavily from the old Italian horror film Demons. Not the whole film, but just my half memories of having watched it as a teenager. There's a particular opening scene where some weird stuff happens in the cinema, and I had some ideas of things that had happened in that I wanted to use in my scenario. But it had been so long since I'd seen it that I couldn't remember how much of it was actually in the film and how much was my misremembering. And I went back and watched it again and realised most of the stuff that I liked was stuff that I'd misremembered and added onto it myself. And I thought, great, okay, I can use all that without worrying about people saying, hey, hang on, you're just ripping off demons. So, yeah. so sometimes I will do stuff like that.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Incidentally, I revisited Demons last year and still holds up. Great movie. Solid movie. You know, if you can deal with the dubbing, I guess. But that's always an issue with an Italian film. You know. Going back to what I was suggesting earlier about horror wanting more of like a creative writing input than maybe other genres do. I guess what I mean by that is I think in a superhero game, for example, you can get away with some dry prose that's just there to set up the stat block, you know? You know, like here's just the prose needed to get to the mechanical bits. That's not true of every superhero thing, but that's kind of my sense of it. But I think like with horror, especially because you never really quite know like what people's familiarity with the genre is going to be, or they might even like have a particular hesitation about presenting grotesque things. Maybe they don't feel like super confident in that. I really love a little bit of nasty, gnarly descriptive text. That's why I really love that annex section of the Necropolis, because it kind of gives you that gruey stuff. I'm a big boxed text apologist. I love a bit of boxed text, and I will die on that hill. I love in like a horror dungeon, just like a little paragraph that just describes something really nasty and gnarly and then lets the table take over after that. I'm so here for that. My own games have things like moments that give you that little creative writing burst. I say all this with the acknowledgement that you never really want to go overboard with it, but there could be too much prose going on in your game writing. But you want enough to kind of inspire the GM. You have to get them into a horror frame of mind. Yeah. And I just don't think a completely clinical presentation of the elements is going to do it.
Yeah, I'm always of two minds about this, because horror RPGs, well, particularly horror scenarios, and scenarios in general, are weird things in that, yes, they serve some of the functions of fiction in terms of, as you're saying, atmosphere and setting the mood and so on. But at the same time, they're instruction manuals, they're technical writing.
Right.
And there has to be a clarity to them to express what is happening. You're basically providing a set of instructions to a GM to how to replicate some of the weird shit that's going on inside your own head at their game
right.
table. Personally, I don't use box text. And I mean, the reason for that, I mean, it's not an ideological one. It's just simply, again, the way that my own brain works. When I'm running stuff at the table, I am a very improvisational GM. I never look at the scenario when I'm running a game. I read it ahead of time. I might make a few notes, a few bullet points, but I will never look at the scenario. And that means that I'll very often go completely off script, and when the players start going off script and I'm having to react to it, then it will end up becoming a very different kind of scenario anyway. So I'm not really interested in box text in that respect, because it very often doesn't apply to what's happening. If it's something in like the Necropolis, where you've got a very simple set of locations, and there isn't, the possibility that the player characters are suddenly going to run away to Cairo and do something there, then that's fine. The box text possibly works in that respect. But most of the time, what I'm trying to do when I write the prose and the description in a scenario is provide the keeper with motifs and ideas and imagery that they can use to bring in, but I expect them, and maybe this is unfair, it perhaps makes it a bit more difficult for beginning keepers, I expect them to make it their own. I expect them to reword things in their own way, put their own spin on things, change things. I'm just offering suggestions here. Do something interesting with it.
I agree with that. And I guess what I would say is, when I say like I'm a box text apologist, for me, it's not so much a matter of, okay, box text as it exists structurally in the module when you're supposed to use it right here at this moment when you enter chamber 35. Yeah. Although certainly that's how the writers usually intend for you to use them, and that's how the game intends for you to use it. But it's more like, if you are more of an improvisational GM, you can easily find the things in the module to at least get your juices running.
Yes.
To get your ideas flowing. And here I'm speaking just of more traditionally laid out modules. In my games, the mysteries, the way they're structured, they are essentially just all box text, right? But they're just split up into different usable pieces. Yeah. Because in a CFB context, you are meant to be doing a lot of improvisation. But you're not like alone. It's all there. And so the quote unquote box text of our mysteries is this one little section of the page that says like moments with like cool things, or you enter a location and it has a quick 3-line description of what that location is. But then it gets to the question of like, and getting everybody involved. When I say I'm like a box text apologist, it's more like when I'm reading a module for the show or to run it, it's often the box text that I can read to get a sense of the writer's point of view creatively in terms of descriptive bits.
Yeah.
I think we essentially agree.
I think so. I mean, I've certainly seen the approach that I take with providing some of that description and some of that flavor that would normally be in box text, putting that in just more general text and advice to the GM. I've seen that catch people out.
A real quick diversion into the differences or things to bear in mind if you're just writing for your home game. I think that's a different thing entirely.
Oh, God,
I think it mostly boils down to, from my mind at least, you only have to write as much as you need. You know your mind better than anyone, and so just write the things that you need in the moment, which is a lot less than if you're writing professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If I'm just running stuff for fun, then for a start, a lot of the games that I've run in recent years have been almost completely improvised. So that's not something that everyone's going to be comfortable with. But even when I'm improvising stuff, I'll still have that basic concept in mind, a hook that the players can buy into, that may be the setting, that may be a reference to a story or a film. It may be some explicit conflict that their characters are going to face, but it's something that I can give to the players ahead of time, sort of say, this is what we're going to be riffing on. And then, again, I'll try to come up with an opening scene that sets everything in motion. And that, to me, is usually enough, but not everyone is as comfortable with that degree of improvisation. And so what I suggest is, at the very least, have some bullet points.
Yeah.
Have some structure in mind, have a few locations, a few conflicts, a few bangs, however you want to think of it, that the players and their characters will face and have to think about. Maybe think about possible resolutions, but don't get too hung up on those. But be prepared to throw all that out the window if things start going in a different and exciting direction. The one thing that I'll almost always prepare ahead of time, just because I am so terrible at doing this on the fly, is names. I will come up with suitable names for the location and the period. One thing that I found is absolutely invaluable when I've done historical games set in different parts of the world in historical time periods is I will look up things like birth and death and census records for that time. And I just pluck names.
Nice.
For some reason, death records just make me particularly happy. I'll just, I'll find all the people who died in the most horrible ways, and I'll just give those as names to NPCs throughout.
Fantastic. So I talked earlier about something I do a lot in my writing is my game writing is very much about emulating genre, and that's just how I write. It's what I write. And so I like to immerse myself in that genre. What are the classic works in that subgenre, that kind of thing. But also one thing you can do, and this is a great tip, I think, for you listeners who are thinking about doing horror writing, horror game writing, horror podcasts are a terrific resource, like fiction podcasts, a terrific resource for exploring genre, because a fiction podcast is the closest thing to what we do in tabletop role-playing games. And what I mean by that is they're reading off a script, but they're just a group of people talking to each other and role-playing, if you will. It used to be called acting, into a mic and doing their thing. There's no visual effects doing any work there. There's no forced perspective or length of a novel that's doing a lot of work there. At the game table, you are acting, you are improvising, you are doing that. You don't have the benefit of visual effects and things like that. You really just have the words that you're speaking at the table. And when you're writing, it's the words you write down. And so I think a fiction podcast is really, really great because it focuses on the key things, what we do in our medium. So if you're just trying to save a little time, you don't want to go read the works of H.P. Lovecraft, give that fantastic BBC Lovecraft series a go instead.
Yeah.
Did you have any last minute thoughts on writing horror for games?
Something that I do if I'm stuck on imagining stuff or coming up with complications or just expanding on an initial idea is I will basically try to get myself into hypnagogic or hypnopompic states by luckily, because I don't have a proper day job, I have the luxury of being able to sleep in the mornings, and that to me is sometimes the most productive time when I'm lying in that half awake state.
Yes,
I can get the ideas that I'm stuck on into my mind, and I'm half awake, half asleep. My mind just runs with those ideas. I'll keep a notebook nearby or just the voice recorder app on my phone, and I'll just come up with whatever weird shit my brain comes up with. Most of the time it's absolute nonsense and completely unusable, but every now and then, yeah, some good stuff comes out of it.
Fantastic. I love it. Well, great combo. Let's go to the companion adventures. All right, it's the companion adventures, and let's see. It looks like we have movies. Do you have a book, I guess, as well? Are these books or stories? Let's see here.
Yes, yeah, I've got a short story, a book, and a film.
Let's start with the movie, though. What's your movie rec?
This is going back to the Necropolis. The film that I'd recommend, I mean, there's any number of films about mummies and Egyptology
So many.
and so on, that you're spoiled for choice there. But the film that struck me as being great potential inspiration to get into the mood for this is The Descent, because you have a group of people. In this case, they're cavers, they're going into this subterranean space, but it's the same kind of thing. You're trapped somewhere subterranean, you're trapped inside. There are creatures around, and you've got dwindling resources, you're struggling with light, you don't know how you're going to get out of it. And I think that feeling of claustrophobia and the darkness pressing in, everything there that you've got in The Descent, if you can bring that into the Necropolis, it's really going to bring it to life.
Yeah. Descent, great movie. Love it so much. I don't have any movie recommendations. I just have book recommendations. And so why don't we go into books and stories and things? My recommendations are both for the writing part of this episode. I'm going to recommend both of Stephen King's nonfiction works, On Writing and Danse Macabre. I only just read Danse Macabre last year, but I've read On Writing several times in my life. I happen to think that Stephen King is one of our best writers. It's very easy to not consider him that because he's so commercial and so popular, but he's actually a really, really skilled writer. And On Writing is an interesting book because it's essentially like part memoir, part writing advice book. Yeah. It's pretty good for like the sort of like mechanics of writing as far as that goes. I still have a few little tips of his that I apply to my writing even to this day. But I think what's even better about On Writing is when you read that book, at least when I do, I'm like pumped up to go write something, right? like I read that and he has such a good way of making the craft of writing feel like such a noble and worthy and fun pursuit that you can't help but read that and not want to just immediately go create, whether you're writing or doing any kind of creation. And so I really, really love it. It's a pretty breezy read and worth it. Danse Macabre, which I read last year, this was a collection of interconnected essays about the horror genre that King published, or that was published in the early 80s. Basically, he goes by like medium and talks about like 5 or 6 works in that medium and what they mean to him and how he thinks they affected the evolution of the horror genre. So like there's a book section, a film section, and so forth. What's really great about Danse Macabre is It was published in the early 80s, right before the slasher boom happened. It has a perspective on the horror genre that is hard to find now. Because I think when the slasher boom happened in the 80s, for good and ill, it changed everyone's idea of the horror genre. On the bad end of it, I think it makes a lot of people unfairly think that horror is just one thing, it's just gore and slashers. And on the good end of it, the good intentioned end of it, it gives a lot of thinkers on the topic a bit of myopia in terms of like what horror is and what it can be. And it all kind of is like from the 80s onward, right? Yeah. So Danse Macabre is great because it only mentions Friday the 13th once and kind of in passing. And it's actually really funny how it just mentions it like briefly in passing. And you're like, wow, this is clearly a product of a different time. But it goes in depth on the horror genre starting from the early 20th century up through around the 70s and gives you a look at time periods which I think are kind of glossed over nowadays. Just a really interesting read in that sense.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you get these little time capsules from moments in the history of horror. There are a couple of books that influenced me that are along those lines. One is a book by Dennis Gifford called A Pictorial History of Horror Movies, which I read when I was about 8 years old. And Gifford was this media historian and critic. He was mainly interested in comics, but he was a big horror fan. And he wrote this book, I think, in the late 60s. It was published around 1970 or so. And he was a big fan of the Universal era in particular and the old black and white horror films. And it's really weird reading this because a lot of it is him railing against the crassness and the grotesqueness of the Hammer films, which to him crossed the line and just ruined what good horror was about. And then, along those lines, even more weirdly, Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho and actually someone I'm about to mention in a different context, wrote his autobiography called Once Around the Block, in which he talks about...
What a name.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic.
In which he talks about his childhood experiences of going out to the cinema, but he was a child during the silent movie era, and he grew up and imprinted on Lon Chaney and things like the Phantom of the Opera, and this to him was the high point of horror. And he rails against basically talkies. For him, from that point onwards, horror, as soon as they brought in voices, was ruined.
Yeah. It's so funny because you just know there was someone in the early aughts railing against torture porn, you know, and like, you could just see it, it's so great. I love that. Well, what were the other recommendations you have story-wise?
Okay, the two recommendations I had, again, for the Necropolis, are probably the things that inspired it the most. One is this weird story, weird more for the way it was written and came about than for the story itself, which is known under two names, Imprisoned with the Pharaohs or Under the Pyramids, that was written by H.P. Lovecraft, but published under the name Harry Houdini. And the reason for it is that Harry Houdini, being the master self-publicist he was, decided that at some point, because Weird Tales was a fantastically popular publication at the time, that he was going to collaborate with them. And he wrote a few columns for Weird Tales, but Weird Tales also published, I think, in the end, about 3 stories that were purportedly by Houdini, that were telling stories of his miraculous escapes from weird situations. And he got Lovecraft to write one of these. And, I mean, it is a very Lovecraft story. It all takes place, as the title indicates, under the pyramids, in this hidden chamber under the Great Pyramids, where there are creatures very much like the Abomination from the Necropolis. These creatures that have been put together out of human and animal parts, these mummified undead monstrosities. But what makes it really weird is how much it fails as a Houdini story. Because, Jason, if I were to say to you, what is Houdini known for?
Escaping from tanks of water.
Yeah.
And chains and things.
Yeah, exactly. So, in it, Houdini is basically taken captive by this sinister tour guide, who may not really be a tour guide, tied up with rope and lowered down into this catacomb under the Great Pyramid. Does he escape from the rope? Does he fuck? So at some point it describes them dropping this impossibly long length of rope onto him, and he passes out and stuff like that. And when he wakes up, he's just coincidentally got out of it. And then he's crawling around in the dark under the pyramids and these strange catacombs, seeing all these things man was not meant to know. And he escapes. He escapes from the situation by sneaking past them and going up a flight of stairs. It's a fun story, and I think it's a great bit of inspiration if you're going to run the Necropolis for describing some of these weird locations. But as a Houdini story, meh. Yeah. The related one, I mentioned Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch wrote a whole bunch of Cthulhu mythos stories in his early years. He was a correspondent of Lovecraft and was deeply inspired by Lovecraft, and he decided that he was going to make the mythos his own, though, and instead of writing a lot of Lovecraft pastiches, he went very much into Egyptology and wrote these weird Egyptian mythos tales. And there's one in particular called the Brood Bubastis, which again is very, very much like the Necropolis in that it does have all these undead monstrosities with animal heads and so on running around. Of course, it also takes place in Cornwall for some fucking reason, but... But apart from that, it's a great Egyptian horror story.
Love it. Well, that was fantastic. Scott, thanks so much for coming on Fear of a Black Dragon.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on, Jason. I've had a blast.
Where can people find you online?
If you want to find me online, you can find me at blasphemoustomes.com, which is the website for the good friends of Jackson Elias, the podcast that I do with Matt Sanderson, where we talk about Call of Cthulhu and weird fiction and all sorts of other cool stuff. Alternatively, you can find me on the Ain't Slayed Nobody podcast, along with Jason quite a lot of the time, as well as How We Roll and Grizzly Peaks Radio.
Fantastic. Let's go hang out with Tom for a bit. I'm back with Tom. Hello, Tom.
Hello. That was good.
Yeah, it was good, right?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued now. I'm definitely going to have to go and give this a read, I think.
You could probably read it in like 20 minutes, if I'm being honest. It's really short.
I think the position of standard starting out Call of Cthulhu scenario has been occupied quite firmly for decades by the Haunted House one, and maybe a little bit by some of those like a pretty old, maybe fusty at this point scenario. So it's really interesting to hear about a new one that's taking, I don't know, lessons from years of experience and making it into an introduction. So that was pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels finely tuned to be like the perfect starting scenario for Call of Cthulhu. I actually really I've been thinking about it more since we recorded that talk. I've been thinking a lot about the Necropolis as a prologue. I find that really, really appealing. And I would never run Call of Cthulhu. Like that is firmly not my jam. But I've been thinking a lot about how to do Cthulhu Dark as like a little short campaign. You know, Cthulhu Dark's normally a one-shot game, but I think there's a way you could do it to where you could make it last a little longer. And I think it would be fun to do a proper Cthulhu Dark one-shot with a different group of characters in the Necropolis that sets up your campaign later. And that would be easy to do because Cthulhu Dark is such a quick character creation and quick game to play. So I thought it was really great. What'd you think of the Expert Delve talking horror writing? Have you done a lot of horror writing yourself?
I've done a bit, although actually my published work I think is not that horror focused, but I certainly do plenty for my own groups and so on. And I think
I'd say your writing's more like historical. You're more of a historical RPG writer. I feel like historical scenarios.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's fair. Like kind of more domestic drama kind of stuff. But but no, it's always good to hear people's processes though, which I find fascinating about this, because I think it's sometimes easy to try and take that kind of discussion as if it's prescribing you a list of things to do, and if you bounce off one or two ideas to switch off. But actually, I really like hearing the different ways that people do things, which amply illustrated in this Expert Delve, I think. Because even if you hear someone talk about how they write a scenario and you think, I would never do that, that gives you an opportunity to reflect on why you would never do that and the value of that. So it gives you a good perspective on how your own methods work for you, as well as like maybe just get some good ideas that you can steal. So yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah, I was really happy to have gotten Scott on. Folks, listeners, just so you have a little bit more context, Scott and I have we've played 2 full campaigns together of my games. We did a public access campaign, and then we did a Between campaign. And the Between campaign is currently on Ain't Slayed Nobody feed. And I just really, really grown very attached to Scott. We share a lot in common in terms of like our sensibilities for role-playing games. And so I was really, really excited to get him on, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. Listeners, that is our show for today. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. We can be found on our website, gauntlet-rpg.com, or brindlewoodbay.com if you prefer. We are on Blue Sky, rather, as I'd say Twitter. We are definitely not on Twitter anymore. We're on Blue Sky at Gauntlet RPG. And if you'd like to support the show on Patreon, we always love a little bit of support over there. Go to patreon.com/gauntlet. Hey, maybe you are not in a place where you can support the show financially. One thing you can do is you can go to Apple Podcasts and give our show a review and rating. That helps us achieve some more visibility. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to tremendous guest Scott, of course, and to our intractable editor, Rich Rogers. And thank you, listeners, for listening. Take care.
Take care.